In 1870, a typical cowboy went months without bathing and took care of personal hygiene in ways that would make any modern person recoil immediately. And the reason wasn't simple carelessness. In this video, you'll find out what life was really like for a cowboy in the Old West, the brutal cowboy routine, the habits that still shock people today, the scarce food, and the grueling work that made a cowboy's daily life a constant fight for survival. The story of the Old West that Hollywood never told is much harder and more fascinating than the American Western shown on screen. What it was like to live in the Old West was something that few of us would hold up for more than a few days. And it all starts before the sun even rises. The smell arrived before anything else. Burnt coffee at the bottom of an iron can, pork fat crackling over coals, the thick odor of cattle just a few yards away, and the sharp stench of sweat from men who slept in yesterday's clothes, and the day before that. It was 4 in the morning on the Texas prairies, and the camp cook was already hollering at the top of his lungs. There was no clock. There was no kindness. There was work. A cowboy's day-to-day life began without any ceremony whatsoever. Teddy Blue Abbott, one of the most celebrated cowboys of the American frontier, described in his memoirs, recorded in the book We Pointed Them North, published in 1939, that waking up before dawn was as absolute as it was inevitable. The cook would bang on an iron skillet with a spoon and shout, "Roll out!" with the conviction of a man who knew that any delay would cost the outfit. The man who took longer than a few minutes would find cold coffee and bacon already eaten up by the quicker ones. There were no second chances at camp, but before even thinking about food, there was a ritual that Western movies never showed honestly: checking your boots. Every cowboy who slept out in the open knew that scorpions, rattlesnakes, and tarantulas had the inconvenient habit of settling inside footwear overnight, drawn in by the residual warmth of the leather. The universal practice was to shake each boot out hard before putting it on, a motion as automatic as breathing, usually learned after the first painful scare. Many didn't get that chance to learn from their own mistake. The Tombstone Epitaph and other newspapers of the era recorded countless cases of men bitten right inside camp before even hitting the trail. What served as a bed for these men was a bedroll, a thick wool blanket wrapped in a waterproof canvas. There was no pillow. The saddle, folded and set on the ground, served that purpose in a way no modern orthopedist would approve of. On rainy nights on the Texas prairies or the Kansas Territory, the canvas barely helped. On bitter, cold nights in the Northern Territories, like the Dakota Plains or Wyoming Territory, many woke up with frost-covered beards and damp clothes stuck to their bodies, their breath forming small white clouds in the freezing pre-dawn air. Here's a detail that most people never stop to think about. Cowboys slept in the clothes they wore during the day. All of them. Spurs included in some cases. It wasn't eccentricity, it wasn't laziness. It was the pure and simple necessity of men who knew that a hostile Indian attack, a sudden cattle stampede, or a horse thief could happen at any moment of the night. Needing 2 minutes to get fully dressed could cost you your life, your whole outfit, or the entire herd. Survival dictated the customs. Life in the Old West imposed a brutal physical adaptation on the human body that goes far beyond mere discomfort. Sleeping between 4 and 5 hours a night for weeks on end was the norm during a cattle drive, the so-called cattle drive, which could last between 2 and 4 months without a break. Historian Robert Utley, in his studies on the American frontier, documented that chronic exhaustion was one of the leading causes of accidents on the trail. A tired man reacts slower, makes worse decisions, falls off his horse much more easily, makes mistakes that in a different line of work would be tolerable, but out on the prairie were fatal. And the morning, that brief interval between waking up and heading out, which lasted on average less than 30 minutes, was the only time of day when something resembling a routine existed. The cook served beans with salt pork, sourdough biscuits, and the coffee that defined the cowboy's emotional and physical existence. Nothing else. There was no alternative menu, no option of "I'm not hungry" or "I want something different today." Work started in minutes, and a man who didn't eat was a problem for himself and for everyone else around him. By 5 in the morning, when the sky was still gunmetal grey at the edges of the horizon and the last stars hadn't fully disappeared, the horses were saddled, the cattle were being rounded up and pushed down the trail, and another day had begun. Without any audible complaint, without any real choice, just the work ahead and weeks of open prairie in every direction. In Hollywood movies, the cowboy rides into town with his clothes just photogenically dusty, quickly washes his face in a metal basin, and is already presentable enough to sit down at the saloon bar, smile at the prettiest girl in the place, and settle a duel at sundown with perfect lighting. His hair is slightly tousled in a way that looks calculated. His beard perfectly trimmed to communicate controlled masculinity. The smell? Impossible to gauge through the screen, but the overall impression is that it's no problem at all. The reality of life without hygiene in the past was completely different, and the curiosities of the Old West regarding this specific aspect are, to put it mildly, deeply unsettling to any modern observer. A cowboy on a long cattle drive, like the ones that ran the Chisholm Trail from the pastures of Texas all the way to the markets of Abilene, Kansas, covering more than 900 miles of rough terrain, could go between 30 and 90 days without taking a full bath. It wasn't an exaggeration or a conscious choice. It was the logistical reality of living in constant motion. In territories where rivers and streams were unreliable, the available drinking water was kept exclusively for drinking and cooking, and the time available for anything beyond work was essentially zero. When a river or lake appeared on the route during the journey, and when the pace of the drive allowed for a longer stop, what passed for a bath in that world took place. The men would wade in with their clothes on to wash themselves and their clothes at the same time. Without soap most of the time, animal tallow, rendered beef or pork fat, was the most common and available substitute. It worked reasonably well to remove the heaviest built-up grime, but the resulting smell wasn't exactly an improvement over the previous state. It was just a different smell. The customs of the Old West regarding dental hygiene were equally far removed from any standard we'd recognize today. Most cowboys didn't own a toothbrush and never had. Some used a thin twig from certain trees to rub their teeth, a practice also documented among rural populations of the period across all of North America. Others simply did nothing. Cavities were absolutely universal. Tooth loss before the age of 40 was so common it was expected, and the nearest dentist could be days of riding away. And when one existed, his main tools were a sturdy pair of pliers and the strength of his own arms. But perhaps the most shocking aspect for a contemporary observer is precisely what replaced toilet paper, mentioned directly in the title of this video. In the Old West, that item simply didn't exist the way we know it. Tree leaves, dry grass, smooth stones polished by rivers, dried corn, all of it served as an alternative depending on what was available at the moment. Sears Roebuck, which began producing its famous printed catalogues in the late 19th century, is often associated with the emergence of a gentler substitute for that specific purpose. The pages of the catalogue itself, plentiful, made of relatively soft paper, and found in practically every ranch, fort, and camp of the era. It was one of the most popular uses for the catalogue, even though it was never officially advertised as such. Lace were a permanent and completely democratic companion of frontier life. Nearly every cowboy had lice at some point during a long drive, regardless of social standing or experience. The most common treatment was kerosene rubbed vigorously into the scalp, a painful and potentially toxic method in excess, but one that partially worked as a treatment. Historian D. Brown, in his research into everyday life on the American frontier, documented that parasite infestations were so completely normalized that they were rarely even mentioned in personal diaries and letters, not out of shame, but because they were part of life the same way the wind and the dust were. The bandana, that colorful kerchief every cowboy wore permanently around his neck, was, in real practical terms, the most versatile hygiene tool of the American Old West. It served to cover the nose and mouth against the permanent cloud of dust kicked up by thousands of cattle hooves, to wipe the constant sweat from the face, to filter questionable water in emergency situations, to serve as an improvised bandage for wounds of any kind, and yes, to wipe the face when a basin of water was available. It was literally the only personal hygiene item that most cowboys carried in their gear. And it was washed when there was water left over for that purpose, which happened rarely. The collective smell of a cowboy's camp in the middle of a cattle drive was something that historical accounts of the era describe with a rare unanimity. A dense mix of accumulated human sweat, cattle manure, leather scorched by the relentless sun, animal fat, green wood smoke, and the specific smell of horses. It was not the romantic setting of any Western film. It was, according to Teddy Blue Abbott himself in his memoirs, simply the smell of the frontier, so constant and all-encompassing that the cowboys themselves eventually stopped noticing it. Survival in the Old West depended heavily on a man that cowboys rarely praised in public, but whom they all deeply feared to cross: the camp cook, universally known as Cookie. Without him, a cattle drive stopped. Not for sentimental or ceremonial reasons, but out of absolute physical necessity. Without reasonably regular food, men who worked 12 to 14 hours a day under blazing sun or cutting cold simply passed out in the saddle. Cookie was, in the real hierarchy of the American West, often more important to the success of the mission than the trail boss himself. And the central instrument of that work was the chuck wagon, the supply wagon that Charles Goodnight, the legendary Texas cattleman who would become famous for the trail that bears his name, adapted and popularized starting in 1866. Goodnight took an old military wagon made of bois dark wood, tougher than regular timber, and installed a chest with drawers and strategically organized compartments in the back, creating a mobile kitchen that could follow the herd across the prairies without ever falling behind. The idea spread so fast across the territories that within a few years, every self-respecting cattle drive had its own chuck wagon. The most detailed historical records on how these wagons operated are preserved in the archives of the Panhandle Plains Historical Society in Texas. But what exactly did this system produce in terms of everyday food? The absolute and non-negotiable foundation of the cowboys' diet was beans. Slow-cooked over coals for long hours, seasoned with salt pork, and when lucky with onion and garlic, beans were the main source of protein and calories that kept these men on their feet during the long journeys. The sourdough biscuit was the second fundamental pillar of the diet. Made with natural starter kept alive in a ceramic crock that the cook carried with the same care a father gives a newborn. Because the death of the starter meant days without bread, the biscuit was baked in a heavy cast-iron pot buried directly in the coals. The result was not gourmet by any definition. It was dense, calorie-packed, sometimes hard to chew, and resistant to the heat and dust of the environment. Beef jerky completed the basic diet. Strips of beef or game meat, dried under the relentless sun or over-controlled smoke, were the emergency reserve when hunting failed and the bean supply was dangerously low. It was a technique learned in large part from the Native American peoples who had inhabited those lands for centuries. The Comanche and Lakota nations produced a more sophisticated variation called pemmican, a compact mix of ground dried meat, solidified animal fat, and pressed wild berries, which was, according to modern estimates by nutritionists who have studied the food, one of the most calorie-efficient preparations ever developed by any human culture in any historical period. Cowboys who had regular contact with native communities knew this food and openly acknowledged its superiority for long journeys across tough terrain. Coffee was, in every possible and imaginable sense, sacred in that world. There was no negotiating around coffee. A cowboy who came back to camp after hours in the saddle and found no coffee ready was a cowboy with a temper problem that affected the entire outfit. The beans were roasted directly in an iron skillet over the fire, ground with a flat rock or with the reinforced handle of a revolver when necessary, and boiled in water inside a metal can with no filter and no strainer of any kind. The thick ground settled at the bottom of the cup. You drank it just like that without ceremony. Strong, bitter, hot enough to burn the tongue of anyone not used to it. Andy Adams, in his book The Log of a Cowboy, published in 1903, described camp coffee as the only true luxury the prairie offered without charging an extra price. There was also the permanent problem of food preservation. Without refrigeration of any kind, fresh meat lasted only a few hours in the hot summer months on the Texas or Arizona Territory prairies. Salt was the main and practically only available preservative, and it was used in amounts that would cause immediate alarm in any modern nutritionist. It is estimated that a cowboy in full cattle drive activity needed somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories a day, given the level of physical activity required. But the nutritional quality of that intake was noticeably poor. Little vitamin C, which caused scurvy in the most prolonged cases, chronic excess of sodium, and protein of quite variable quality and availability. The hard life of the Old West took its toll not only in obvious physical injuries, but in health that quietly deteriorated over years of labor. And when the herd passed through a town along the route, an event that happened a few times during a long drive, depending on the path, the cowboy had temporary access to what he called real food. Quality fresh meat, bakery bread with proper leavening, fruit when in season. Adams, in The Log of a Cowboy, described the moment his outfit reached Dodge City after weeks on the trail as the best feeling a man could have on top of a bad pair of boots. Indeed, in 1872, Nat Love was 16 years old when he arrived in Dodge City, Kansas, with little more than the clothes on his back, feet sore from a long walk, and an unshakable determination to find work as a cowboy. The son of formerly enslaved people from Tennessee, Love would learn over the following decades everything there was to know about the work of a cowboy in the American West, and would record in his 1907 autobiography that life was the hardest and the freest a man could find on the continent. The two words didn't contradict each other. They were absolutely inseparable in the reality of the frontier. The real work of a cowboy, completely stripped of the cinematic idealizations of any era, was essentially agrarian in its most brutal and unforgiving nature. It was moving live cattle, sometimes 2,000, sometimes 3,000 head, from one point to another, across roadless terrain, without reliable maps, under completely unpredictable weather conditions, for months on end without days off or extended rest. The Goodnight Loving Trail, created by Charles Goodnight and his partner Oliver Loving in 1866, cut more than 1,200 miles from far west Texas up to Colorado and then Wyoming. The Western Trail connected the rangelands of central Texas to the market at Dodge City. The Chisholm Trail, the most famous and most documented of all, connected the vast Texas prairies to the stockyards and markets of Kansas, passing through the Oklahoma Territory. Each trail had its specific characteristics, its own dangers, and its particular physical demands. And all of them had one thing absolutely in common: 12 to 14 hours in the saddle, every single day, for months straight, without a break. Sitting on a horse for 14 hours sounds tolerable until you consider what actually happens to a human body when subjected to that condition repeatedly over weeks. Blisters on the hands and thighs that turn into open sores that have no chance to heal because the work keeps going. Back muscles that go into chronic spasm after the second week of the drive. Knees that swell progressively with each day of repeated pressure. Hands that crack from the cruel alternation between the cold of dawn and the midday sun until they bleed at the joints. Veterans used pieces of raw animal hide as improvised protection on their palms. The same things they called gloves, but which bore no resemblance whatsoever to any modern glove in terms of comfort or effectiveness. The greatest physical threat on the job was not the outlaw or the human enemy, as Hollywood always insisted on showing. It was the cattle. A stampede was the technical and existential nightmare of every experienced cowboy on the American frontier. Any unexpected stimulus at the wrong moment could set one off. A nearby lightning strike, a coyote appearing in the middle of the herd, a distant gunshot, the dry crack of a rolling rock in the middle of the night. 2,000 panicked steers running in absolute darkness generated a level of destruction comparable to a living, moving wall of earth. The cowboy who fell off his horse in front of a nighttime stampede rarely got back up. Records from Texas cattle companies document dozens of deaths by stampede between 1865 and 1895, and that number likely significantly underestimates the reality, since many deaths in remote areas were simply never formally reported to any authority. The horse was, in that world, the most vital extension of the cowboy's own body. Losing a horse on the trail meant triple the work for everyone else, was synonymous with an immediate crisis for the entire outfit. Each man had between 2 and 4 horses in constant rotation. A single animal couldn't hold up under the brutal pace of a full day's work. The care of the animals was a sacred and non-negotiable obligation. Regular shoeing, careful inspection of hooves, checking for wounds and swelling, ensuring constant access to water. A cowboy who mistreated his horse was despised by his companions in a visceral way that no other behavior, not even cowardice, provoked with the same intensity. The pay that made up for all of this? Around $25 to $30 a month in 1870, the rough equivalent of $500 to $800 in today's money, according to estimates from economic historians who specialize in the period. A figure that, when divided by the hours actually worked in a month on the drive, resulted in one of the lowest possible wages for any type of high-risk physical labor of the era. Bill Pickett, the legendary black cowboy who invented and popularized bulldogging, the technique of wrestling steers to the ground by grabbing them by the nose with force and a twist, worked for the equivalent of $20 a month in the 1880s. In conditions that his own account described with an honesty that left no room for romanticism. Imagine you're lying on the dry and slightly frozen earth of a Texas prairie in October of 1875. The thick wool bedroll beneath you barely insulates you from the cold that rises persistently from the ground. In the distance, a coyote howls with a cadence that at the beginning of the trip sounded like a tragic lament, but that after weeks you've learned to tell apart, by ear in the dark, from the howl of a real wolf, because the difference could mean the herd was in danger. The stars above you are so numerous and seemingly close that they look like an inverted second Earth, a map of the universe glued to the vault of the sky. And somewhere out in that absolute and silent dark, 2 mounted men are awake, keeping watch over the sleeping herd. In 2 hours, someone will wake you up to relieve them. The old rural life of the American prairies had no electric lighting, no central heating, and none of the basic security that any permanent structure gives to those who sleep inside it. The night was, without any narrative exaggeration, the most vulnerable period in a cowboy's routine. The night guard system was mandatory and strictly carried out in any cattle drive with enough experience to survive. The cowboys divided into 2-hour shifts throughout the entire night, with 2 or 3 mounted men continuously circling the perimeter of the sleeping herd. The function was dual and equally important. Keep the cattle calm and prevent predators, or cattle thieves known as rustlers, from getting dangerously close. Singing to the cattle during night guard was an absolutely real practice, documented by multiple historical accounts. Slow and monotonous melodies, sometimes without any words at all, sometimes with improvised lyrics of questionable poetic quality, kept the animals in a peaceful half-sleep that significantly reduced the risk of a nighttime stampede. It wasn't romanticism. It was a learned and refined technique passed down through generations of working cattle. The nightly routine also included the constant and necessary watch for snakes. The rattlesnakes and copperheads that inhabited the prairies and dense brush of the south had the same inconvenient habit as the scorpions and tarantulas, actively seeking out human warmth during the night. There were cases documented in the newspapers of the era of men bitten inside their own bedrolls while they slept, and the practice of carefully checking the ground around before lying down, sweeping a stick in a circle to drive away any unwanted visitors from the sleeping area, was taught from veteran to greenhorn as a rite of passage, just as important as learning to handle a lasso or properly saddle a horse. The campfire was the emotional and social center of the night, the human center of gravity around which the outfit gathered. After supper, when the heaviest work of the day had finally ended and the guard rotations hadn't yet begun for everyone, the men sat around the embers in various resting positions. It was the only moment of the entire day when their guard dropped noticeably. Stories were told of towns left behind, of women who were still waiting or had already stopped waiting, of fights that were survived, and of companions who hadn't survived. Songs were played on cheap and frequently out-of-tune guitars, on harmonicas, or simply whistled with some degree of skill. Historian Walter Prescott Webb, in his foundational work The Great Plains, describes these nights around the fire as the only luxury available to men who had traded everything for freedom and poverty in absolutely equal measure. Cold was an enemy chronically underestimated by those who had never experienced it. The northern prairies, Montana Territory, Wyoming Territory, the Dakotas, could see nighttime temperatures that plummeted well below freezing in September and October, months that were still a full part of the cattle working season. A wool blanket, dampened by the afternoon rain, lost much of its insulating capacity quickly and inexorably. Hypothermia killed cowboys, slowly, silently, in a way that many expedition diaries described simply as found in the morning, didn't wake up. There was no drama in dying of progressive cold on those prairies. There was the fact, dry as the ground in August. And there was loneliness. That was perhaps the aspect of nighttime life on the prairie that historical records captured with the greatest honesty and most consistency, because it showed up in diaries and letters with a frequency that stands in sharp contrast to the image of the tough, stoic, and emotionally inaccessible cowboy perpetuated by the movies. Young men, most between 18 and 25 years old, wrote to mothers, sisters, and girlfriends about the immense and overwhelming silence of those open nights, about how the stars seemed closer and more personal than anywhere with walls. Nat Love once described the prairie at night as the most beautiful and the most frightening thing in this world, and that he could never make up his mind between praying and running when he was alone in the dark with 10,000 head of cattle and only the moon for company. In Hollywood cinema, the cowboy's arrival in town is always a cinematically high-stakes event. The music slowly swells. The camera follows the solitary figure riding down the main dirt street, spurs jingling with every step of the horse, eyes squinting calculatingly against the unrelenting sun. In the saloon waiting at the end of the street, there are generous drinks, attractive female company, and maybe an honor duel at sundown with perfect light. It's the well-earned reward for the hard life. It's the moment of glory that all that dust and sweat promised. The historical reality of Old West customs in the end-of-trail towns was, depending on the perspective you analyze it from, more tragic, more comic, or simply more human than any cinematic version ever had the guts to show. When a group of cowboys arrived in Dodge City, Abilene or Ellsworth, at the end of a long 3 or 4 month drive, the first declared and urgent need was not the saloon. It was a bath. Bathhouses existed in every end of Trail Town and did their best business of the year precisely during the peak months of cattle season. For a few carefully counted cents of a salary already partly spent, you could get access to a metal tub with reasonably hot water. The lines were long and patience was short. The cowboys went in with last month's clothes stuck to their bodies, with layers of dust, dried sweat and animal fat, and came out as something that slightly resembled human beings with recognizable hygiene. The owners of the establishments changed the water between customers with a frequency that modern public health standards would uniformly disapprove of. That meant the 5th or 10th man in line was washing himself in water that carried the physical residue of everyone before him. Even so, for someone who had spent 90 days without a bath on the prairies, it was an objective and appreciated improvement. The saloon existed, that is absolute historical fact, but its real function was less glamorous and less dramatic than the mythology perpetuated by decades of cinema suggests. It was essentially a bar of variable quality, with card and domino games, where men who had spent weeks with no conversation beyond work orders could finally get drunk in company and burn off the excess energy that had built up. The quality of the whiskey served in the more affordable establishments was, according to period accounts recorded in the Dodge City Times and in travelers' diaries, frequently adulterated with shredded tobacco, black pepper, and in more extreme documented cases, with compounds that caused temporary blindness and severe abdominal pain in the hours following consumption. Good, expensive liquor existed in the more upscale establishments. Those were financially out of reach for a cowboy, making $25 a month, with equipment to replace and food to buy. Money accumulated over months of work disappeared with startling speed. Essential new work equipment, new clothes, or at least a new shirt that didn't need to be thrown straight in the trash. Food that wasn't beans with salt pork, and maybe a night in a real room with a bed and a roof. All of it consumed months of wages in a matter of days. Wyatt Earp, who served as assistant marshal in Dodge City between 1876 and 1879 and closely observed this cycle, described in later interviews that most cowboys arrived in town with weeks of saved wages and left with practically nothing in their pockets. Not necessarily out of vice or moral irresponsibility, but out of the real need to restock everything that had been worn out or destroyed on the trail, to rest their bodies in ways the trail made impossible, and to feel, for a few counted days, that there was something beyond dust, cattle, and open horizon in every direction. The conflicts that took place in those towns, and that generated decades of mythology around duels and gunfights, were often more mundane and less epic than any cinematic version allows itself to show. Fights over unpaid gambling debts, over wounded pride in an advanced state of intoxication, over old rivalries that the liquor reactivated. The high noon duel with 2 gunfighters facing each other in a completely empty main street, slow motion and absolute silence. That scenario corresponds to a very small fraction of the real armed confrontations documented by the Tombstone epitaph and the records of the U.S. Marshal Service. The majority of historically verified shootings were disorganized nighttime brawls, frequently started by someone in an advanced state of intoxication and poorly lit by anything beyond the weak yellow light of oil lamps hanging on wooden posts. And after a few days, and all the available money, the cowboy hit the road back. A new drive was waiting. A new herd, a new long trail, the same months of dust, beans without variety, nights on the prairie, and work that never fully ended. There was no other path available for most of them. It was the work they knew. It was the life they had chosen, or had found. And it was, as Teddy Blue Abbott wrote, with an honest precision that leaves no room for easy romanticism, the only way of living I knew, and the only one I would have chosen, even if I'd had a real choice. Throughout this video, what became clear is that a cowboy's life in the Old West had nothing glamorous about it in the way the movies have repeated for decades. It was brutal work with very little financial reward, non-existent or unlikely hygiene at best, scarce and monotonous food, medicine that bordered on torture, and nights that alternated between the sublime of infinite stars and the very real terror of stampedes and snakes. These men and women, fewer in number but equally real and equally courageous, built one of the most enduring mythologies in American history with cracked hands, permanently exhausted bodies, and systematically empty pockets. And what's fascinating is that knowing the raw reality, the myth somehow grows even larger, because what they did was genuinely extraordinary, precisely because it was so common, so hard, and so stripped of any reward beyond survival itself. Now, a question for you. Of the hygiene aspects you discovered in this video, from the multi-purpose bandana to 90 days without a bath, to the pages of the Sears catalog, which one do you think would be the hardest to accept if you were actually on a cattle drive through Texas in 1870? Leave it in the comments. It'll be interesting to see the answers. And if this video changed the way you see the real Old West, different from what Hollywood always painted, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we're going to dive deep into something the movies made even more mythical than it deserved. The real story of the most wanted outlaws of the American West, and just how much of what you believe about them is simply well-crafted fiction. Don't miss it.